Hi there, and welcome to my Fashion Stories Box podcast, a podcast about stories in fashion history. I am Catherine, and I'm so glad to welcome you here. Let's discover together interesting facts about fashion and history and fashion history. If you kept a minimum track of what has been happening in these past months in the fashion sphere, you certainly have come across articles mentioning bills from the French government targeting Chinese fast fashion companies. If this is not the case, here is a short brief. On March 14, 2024, the French National Assembly created an historical unprecedented by adopting unanimously at the first reading a bill against the concept of disposable fashion or ephemeral fashion. The declared objective is to reduce the environmental impact of the textile industry as part of wider efforts implemented by the French government for an ecological transition. The main targets of this new bill are Chinese ultra-fast fashion players as Shein, Temu, Alibaba, or even Amazon, which encourage an overconsumption with highly competitive prices through ad campaigns stimulating faster and faster wardrobe changes and new styles propositions every day. Who says overconsumption also implies pollution? The fashion industry is the second most polluting industry. But who says overconsumption also implies very low prices to encourage this overconsumption and the implementation of production practices close to slavery to be able to obtain such low prices. To have a small idea of production practices used by fast fashion players and their social and environmental consequences, here are two documentaries I advise you to watch. The True Cost by Andrew Morgan from 2015 and Inside the Shein Machine from 2022. These are two documentaries I watch with my students as an introduction to a class on sustainable fashion I teach in an intensive program at a fashion school. I will share links to these documentaries in the description of this episode. So, what does this bill provide for? First, it includes a definition of the concept of fast fashion, then the obligation for brands falling under the definition of fast fashion to inform the consumers on the environmental impacts their purchases from them will have, as well as the possibilities to reuse and repair. It also provides for an advertisement ban for brands producing and selling fast fashion items and the implementation of additional taxes from €5 per item in 2025 to €10 per item in 2030 to make fast fashion items less attractive from a price point perspective. In parallel to this bill and in a move towards more transparency, fashion brands will have to mention on their products an eco-score to measure the impacts of each of their products on the planet. This eco-score echoes the Nutri-Score, which has been implemented some years ago on foods to measure the impacts on health and to fight against excess weight. For the fashion eco-score, 8 criteria have been shortlisted: water consumption, textile durability, conditions of production, usage of pesticides and chemicals, microplastics emission, recycled material valorization, fast fashion impacts. This eco-score implementation is expected to progressively happen during 2024 and to be extended to every fashion brand in 2025. This action from the French government aims at slowing down an overconsumption, an excess, in an attempt to contain the ecological crisis. I asked myself if, in the past, similar actions took place regarding consumer goods. And if I'm dedicating a full episode of my podcast on the topic, you can be sure that, of course, there have been similar regulations. The end goals were just a bit different, even though, as you will see, they all tended to a limitation of excesses. Have you ever heard about sumptuary laws or sumptuary edicts? A sumptuary law is a regulation aiming at controlling personal expenses as well as the consumption of some goods as garments, food, or any other type of product perceived as luxurious or unnecessary. Historically speaking, these laws were adopted by societies and governments to reinforce social hierarchies, maintain social order, and to control conspicuous consumption. The majority of these laws dealt with clothing and appearance. They were here to precise who was able to wear what depending on his position on the social ladder. They could include limitations linked with the quality of fabrics, the usage of some colors, some embellishments, some materials, and accessories. In the past, the main goal of these laws was linked to the social status and to reinforcing the social status based on the different social categories: the aristocratic elite, the bourgeoisie, merchants and artisans, peasants, and social outcasts. It wasn't permitted to get dressed in a more conspicuous manner than the upper classes, and penalties for not respecting these codes could be implemented as fines, concerned good sizing, even up to social exclusion, all depending on the importance the different societies were giving to these external signs of wealth. I wanted to go back to the first antique civilizations to gain an idea of what were their practices on that matter. This time travel also enabled me to observe differences of appreciation and valorization of concepts as luxury, excess, and the unnecessary. Our first stop is Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization. Antique Mesopotamia was located between the rivers Tigris and Euphrates, with a territory corresponding more or less to Iraq, eastern Syria, and southeast Turkey. This civilization brought to humanity agriculture, the first cities, the concept of state, writing, and the first legal text, and this starting from the 3rd millennium before our era. The best known of this legislative text is the Code of Hammurabi, who was a Babylonian king whose reign corresponds to the periods between minus 1792 and minus 1750 before Christ, the 18th century before our era. The code in cuneiform writing has been engraved on a 2.25 meter 8 stone tablet and is composed of 282 articles on criminal law, family law, commercial law. You can admire this stone tablet at the Louvre Museum. However, it seems that in this code there is no mentions of possible regulations linked with clothing, external signs of wealth, even though the Mesopotamian societies were organized following a social hierarchy. It seems that these first societies didn't feel the need to formally write down legal text to supervise the consumption of luxury goods, conspicuous expenses, and external signs of wealth. Customs and traditions according to which the most beautiful items, the most luxurious objects, were reserved to the leading elite seem to have been enough and accepted by all. No need for legal reinforcement. Everybody knew their place in the social ladder. Moreover, and this is where it starts to be interesting, Mesopotamian societies seemed to have no negative association linked to luxury and display of wealth. And this is something to keep in mind. Let's now investigate practices in ancient Egypt. And here we can notice similarities. It seems that no legal texts have been found regulating who had to wear what, depending on their social rank. Here again, customs and traditions would have been enough. It was acknowledged that the pharaoh and his family had to wear the thinnest fabrics, the most luxurious jewelry as signs of their divine nature. Priests, depending on the gods they would serve, wore furs or other animal skins and signs associated to the animal reincarnation of the divinity to take their properties. All knew what their place in the social hierarchy was without having the need to have laws to make it clear. All also knew that if someone was trying to dress in a wealthier way than the pharaoh, this act would be perceived as a provocation, a declared will to claim for oneself the divine nature of the leader and to take over his throne. A gesture which could be punished in a more or less harsh way, depending on the level of the offense. For ancient Egyptians, luxury and its display wasn't something seen as pejorative. On the contrary, it was more perceived as the testimony of one's social positions as well as the way to venerate their gods. Everything will change with the ancient Greeks, and the perception of luxury and the necessary need to regulate it through laws to avoid any kind of excesses. Luxury becomes bad when it's for individual purposes. However, it is widely encouraged for collective projects. Laws are in that case needed to regulate the consumption of luxury and to determine what is good luxury and what is bad luxury, incorporating this new notion of excess and unnecessary. This dichotomy, good luxury, bad luxury in ancient Greece, is very well explained in the BBC series of documentaries Guilty Pleasures, Luxury in Ancient Greece and During the Middle Ages, hosted by Michael Scott. To sum it up, luxury was associated with decadence, idleness, femininity, and its display perceived as being contrary to the values of the society at that time. But on the other hand, in some contexts linked with, it seems, funerals or particularly with the common well-being of the society, luxury was encouraged. By the way, and this is an interesting fact, the first sumptuary laws adopted by the ancient Greeks concerned funeral expenses. One example of ancient Greek sumptuary laws linked with the appearance are the laws of Solon in Athens around -594, -593 before Christ, aiming at regulating certain aspects of luxury and conspicuous expenses in the city of Athens. The city of Sparta would have even implemented some laws forbidding its citizens to possess any kind of gold or silver, a decision with a direct influence on jewelry or the use of gold thread to embellish garments. At some point, the display of personal wealth through garments and jewelry became so strictly controlled that only tombs, houses, construction of buildings were possible to testify of the size not of the bank account, but of the purse of a given family and its social achievement. The main goal was to find a balance between the limitation of conspicuous expenses, the respect of traditional practices, and the service to the society in the end objective to improving social standards and preserving the traditional social order. Following pretty much the life principles and philosophies of ancient Greece, the Roman civilization also condemned luxury in its notion of excess. And yet, the Romans have the reputation to be more in the celebration of excesses. Just think of the concept of orgies. However, they also felt the need to legally regulate this display of luxury, of excess. As for the Greeks, luxury combined two natures, a private nature with a negative connotation of idleness, excess, decadence, up to even lack of discipline, waste, and lack of productivity. The public nature of luxury was on its side very much celebrated. Public luxury was perceived as noble and generous, and patrons sponsoring the construction of buildings, the creation of shows for everybody, the organization of public banquets were celebrated by the people. Individual wealth shouldn't be used to satisfy egoistic pleasures and desires, but on the contrary, to be shared with the community for the benefits of all. Under the Roman Republic, as well as under the Roman Empire, sumptuary laws existed and were called leges sumptuarii. They framed the excesses of conspicuous consumption, however, they didn't forbid them. Business is business. Here are some examples of sumptuary laws adopted during the Roman era. To start with, the Lex Oppia, adopted in -215 BC, whose objective was to limit luxury garments for women linked with gold and colors usage in order to promote a more modest lifestyle for women. This law became so unpopular, women rallied and went up to besiege the Senate to such an extent that it was repealed in -195 BC. Quite interesting, isn't it? Another law adopted by the Romans and concerning the appearance is the Rogatio Sumptuary laws of Pompey and Crassus in -55 BC. It aimed at regulating luxury in clothing in general, and not just for women this time, including displays of wealth during banquets. This law came within the scope of a particular context of morality crisis and a coming back to simpler customs. And what about the Middle Ages, this long period of time covering more than 1,000 years and during which the Catholic religion took over on the people's lifestyles? Here again, no surprises. We still find our dichotomy good luxury, bad luxury. Bad luxury still being associated to personal wealth and to its egoistic enjoyment. As for the good luxury, it wasn't about wealth shared with the community, but wealth shared with God. This notion of divinity, of the sacred, takes over, and the cathedrals built during that time are the supreme validation of this notion of good luxury. You were afraid to end up in hell after your death? No worries. By donating all of your money and possessions to the church, you were guaranteed the salvation of your soul and you were buying your VIP place in heaven. Because yes, the more money you were giving, the more donations you were doing, the bigger your chances would be to have your seat on the right side of God, the Holy Father, and to frolic forever with the angels in the Garden of Eden. What a nice program, isn't it? The Middle Ages is a very interesting period when it comes to the codification of the society using different types of fabrics, embellishments, and colors. The latter had a paramount role in the visual recognition of the social status of an individual at the first sight. They also had very specific meanings. As an example, red, purple, and blue were for the leading aristocracy. However, they also could have a bad and a good meaning. That way, there was good red and bad red, good black and bad black. Yellow on its side was always bad. Stripes were associated to the devil and were worn by social outcasts. If this topic is of interest for you, I can only highly recommend you the reading of Michel Pastoureau's little books on colors. And in the future, I might dedicate an episode on the life of colors and their perceptions over the ages. Let me know if you would be interested in such a subject. It is, anyway, a very fascinating one. When it comes to sumptuary laws on appearance and clothing, we need to wait for the end of the Middle Ages around the 13th and 14th centuries. Why so? Well, because starting from that time, the society becomes more and more urbanized. We also see the bourgeoisie emerging as a new social class competing with the traditional aristocracy when it comes to displaying wealth. And we can notice that during the 14th century, the modern concept of fashion, in the sense of a faster change in styles, appear. Starting from that moment in Western Europe, men and women from the aristocratic elite will take care more and more of their appearance as a way to underline their individuality and wealth. Competitions would even take place to determine who is going to have the longest sleeves, even hanging down to the floor, the most padded doublets to give a visual impression of physical strength, the most colored and embellished garments, the most luxurious fabrics, the shoes with the highest heels, the famous chopins, or with the longest points, the famous poulain. The race would be so competitive to outdo everyone else that several families will go bankrupt. And to limit this small family economic crisis, which had an impact on trade, To maintain, as usual, social order, local governments will enforce laws. The first medieval sumptuary laws will appear in Italy, the Renaissance cradle. In the middle of the 14th century, the government of Florence adopted a series of laws implementing a system of taxes for garments for men seen as too much luxurious. These laws could also forbid boys under the age of 7 to wear multicolored garments, fabrics with gold or silver threads, embroideries, and silk. In 1497, still in Florence, a law forbade this time boys under the age of 14 to wear gold, silver, silk, ribbons, velvet, or satin. In France, a law from 1485 has been asked to the General Estates, the assembly representing the three main society groups of the time, the aristocracy, the clergy, the Third Estate, after the observing of crazy expenses following the death of the King Louis XI, declaring that, quote, the excess of expenses of garments is a bankruptcy for the kingdom, unquote. You can notice here that we still talk about a notion of excess. The end of the Middle Ages sumptuary laws in Western Europe are less linked to the respect of religious principles and more about limiting the increasing competition of the bourgeoisie facing the aristocracy. We are here in a context of maintaining the social order. The Renaissance period will see the development of these sumptuary laws. In France, during the 16th century, 11 sumptuary edicts have been enforced to limit outbids and class competitions by specifying the type of fabrics to wear, trying to forbid embroideries, lace, gold, or silver embellishments for the bourgeoisie to wear. The lower classes, peasants, and others didn't have the right to wear velvet and silk. In case of non-respect of these laws, fines were enforced. According to you, do you think these laws were really effective? Well, not really. The bourgeoisie, the recipient of all these prohibitions, preferred to pay the fines than to refrain from wearing laces or gold threads embroideries in this society where people literally wore their wealth. In Italy, in the same period, sumptuary laws were more targeting women and were written in collaboration with the church. Depending on their life stage, their function in the society, women had to wear particular dresses and headwear, which ornamentations and shapes would be dictated by decrees. It was a way to encourage modesty, respectability, and to fight against the big spending and style-conscious nature of women who were not able to resist temptation contrary to men. This was what people thought at that time. In Great Britain, Queen Elizabeth I will also implement a series of decrees regarding the padding of men's doublets, among others, and to ensure that each subject of her kingdom doesn't dress above its social station. The 17th century will also have its lot of sumptuary edicts, and here is an abstract of a sumptuary edict promulgated by the French King Henry IV, grandfather of the King Louis XIV, between 1601 and 1606. We expressly forbid all our subjects, no matter their quality or condition, in all the places and lands of our obedience, to wear gold nor silver, nor excess of fabrics on their dress in any way, nor for any excuse, at the exception of prostitutes and rogues, for whom we don't take enough interest to do the honor to give them our attention to their behavior." Unquote. Louis XIII, Louis XIV's father, had an austere personality and was a king promoting modesty and a simple lifestyle. He will enforce sumptuary laws starting from 1613, 3 years after having been crowned King of France. All these laws will end up as the Code of Clothing in 1633 to prevent the bourgeoisie to imitate the aristocracy, as well as to limit clothing competitions and the display of wealth, seen as immoral by this pious and austere king. This code recommended the usage of plain fabrics and banned lace on collars and cuffs. Louis XIV, the infamous Sun King, won't be against sumptuary laws neither. Some of them will even be mentioned in plays from Molière, as a law from 1660 mentioned in the play The School of Husbands. Oh, 3 and 4 times be blessed this edict to which luxury clauses are forbidden. To encourage consumption of locally produced fabrics and other embellishments and the development of the French textile industry, Colbert, the Comptroller General of Finances of Louis XIV, will also implement restrictions regarding the consumption of imported goods. Does it ring a bell? The injunction to consume locally is not the prerogative of our 21st century. Louis XIV would have been at the origin of the Great Order on the policies for costumes. Even if the content of this order remains in majority unknown, as well as the year of its adoption, it seems that this law aimed at standardizing and regulating military uniforms, as well as those of civilians, to limit external signs of wealth and class distinctions. All of this in the objective of control and homogenization of clothing practices for the people of the Kingdom of France. The ban of wearing some materials depending on one's social category, the refraining of clothing competition, the protection of class privileges, the promotion of morality, the encouragement of charity to the poorest and donations to the church for the salvation of one's souls, any other economic reasons, motivations behind the numerous sumptuary laws of the 17th century depending mainly from the personality and the mood of the king. One thing remains the same nevertheless. Nobody can dress better than the king. The king is the face of his kingdom on the international political scene, and he has to be its best possible ambassador. In order to make sure everybody understood that the kingdom is rich and the treasure full of gold bars, the king has to be dressed accordingly. And if it's not the case, it's not important. Everything is a question of appearance, of representation. And this question of appearance, of a certain vanity from the leading class regarding their wardrobe, seems to have been heavily criticized several times during the 17th century. You want us to dress in a more modest way? That we use less lace or silks? Okay, no problem. We will do so when the king will show the example. The 18th century up to the French Revolution will see the adoption of new sumptuary edicts. However, the society is changing and the efficiency of these laws is not conclusive, supposing they have been at some points. All these sumptuary laws, together with the privileges of classes, will be abolished on August 4, 1789, by the deputies of the French National Assembly. A project of a revolutionary costume, a sort of dress code to be worn by all the French citizens to reinforce the notion of equality prôned by the French Revolution, will even be discussed, to be abandoned later on. At the origin of this costume was the idea of a uniformization of clothes to erase not only the social differences but also the regional ones and to show the unity of France. Instead of this, the French National Convention will adopt in 1793 a decree related to dress for both genders. The first article of this decree stipulates, "Nobody from one or the other sex can force any citizen or citizeness to dress a way or another or to be subject to be considered and treated as a suspect and pursuing as agitators of public rest. Each is free to wear any kind of garment of his gender." At the end of the 18th century, the social equality is proclaimed. Everybody can dress the way they want, and no law can impose or ban a garment, a fabric, or embellishment. It's the freedom of dress. Clothing access and competition, condemned by the ancient Greeks, are now encouraged and even stimulated during the Industrial Revolution, the birth of the consumption society, end of modern capitalism. The new god to satisfy is now money, and all sacrifices are good for it. No more needs of laws to limit conspicuous consumptions. The new regulation is currency. The Napoleonic period at the beginning of the 19th century will see the establishment of economic boycotts and the ban of products imported particularly from Great Britain. Before moving on in our exploration to the 20th century, I asked myself if these practices of sumptuary laws regulating personal expenses were before all a Western European characteristic. And it seems that it's not the case. My research made me discover that cases of sumptuary laws have been found in Imperial China. Some sources mention examples of sumptuary decrees during the Ming Dynasty between 1368 and 1644 and the Qing Dynasty from 1644 to 1912. These laws regulated garments, hairstyles, and embellishments and took the form of dress codes depending on the social class. An example is linked with the yellow color, which was reserved exclusively to the members of the imperial family. These laws were also here to reflect the principles prôned by Confucius as kindness, rectitude, good manners, wisdom, loyalty, respect of the parents, respect of life and death. These topics deserve more complex studies and research. As we saw, the 19th century is the century of the Industrial Revolution and of the capitalist bourgeoisie. Sumptuary laws don't exist anymore, and nothing comes to refrain consumption and the display of wealth. With the industrialization, however, we see developing movements for the protection of workers' rights. New laws are enforced to control the production conditions and trade practices, setting the basis for the fashion industry as we know it today. But nothing will come to limit this consumption, not as we could see in the past. The two world conflicts of the 20th century will bring with them limitations impacting more directly the production in order to focus it on war efforts. If we take the example of the Second World War, several economic actions have been implemented. Rationing tickets, limiting the quantity of garments or fabrics people could buy, the promotion of a stricter, more austere utilitarian styles consuming less raw materials, the conversion of textile factories to military needs and not civilian ones, the control of prices to limit the inflation, and even the imposition of the maximum quantity of garments an individual could possess, above which it wasn't possible to buy new ones. The objectives were to manage the resources which became scarcer and scarcer and to divert them to support the war efforts as well as to maintain social order. Controls and penalties could be enforced. Did it work? The black market never gets better than in cases of bans. Moreover, instead of buying rationed new garments or new fabrics, people would recycle, repair, mend, transform what they already possessed. Even in case of extreme situations, the human seems to always find a way to go around laws, difficulties of access, and bans. And today, what does regulate consumption? The price, of course, and all the marketing linked with the notion of branding, its real and perceived values communicating in ad campaigns and other collaborations with celebrities to make the product more attractive. And in case of political or diplomatic conflicts, it's not laws which will be enforced to penalize one or the other part, but the implementation of economic and commercial boycotts to exercise any kind of pressure. So, what did we learn during this episode? The regulation of access to consumption of goods linked with appearance is not something new nor a characteristic of our modern society. We learned that even if the motivations have been different, maintaining the social order, promoting morality and modesty, dichotomy good luxury, bad luxury, economic or political motivations, All these laws had the same and unique end, controlling excesses and the conspicuous display of real or perceived wealth. Are we able to say that these laws reached their objectives no matter the period of time? The answer is a bit less obvious. Remember these Roman women protesting against the Lex Oppia, obtaining its repeal, or the bypassing options as the black market. With this historical analysis in mind, shall we conclude that this new bill to stop fast fashion and its excess will follow the same road as its ancestors? The future will tell us, and feel free to share your point of view on this topic. Thank you very much for having listened to this episode of my Fashion Stories Box podcast. Now you're unbeatable on sumptuary laws and the regular tries don't regulate conspicuous consumption and its excesses. Feel free to subscribe to the podcast wherever you listen your podcast, to connect with me on Instagram and Facebook to complete the podcast with some visuals. And if you like my podcast, feel free to leave a comment or a review. I would really appreciate it. I am Catherine, and this is my Fashion Stories Box podcast, a podcast about stories in fashion history. See you next time for a new Fashion Story Box.